It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Greg Miller, Chief Science Officer and Executive Vice President of Research, Regulatory, and Scientific Affairs for Dairy Management, Inc., National Dairy Council, as well as an Adjunct Associate Professor in the Department of Food Science and Nutrition at the University of Illinois. Dr. Miller graduated from Michigan State University with a Bachelor's of Science in Nutrition and earned a Master's of Science degree in Nutrition Toxicology from the Pennsylvania State University. He then received his PhD in Nutrition Toxicology from the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Miller is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of the American College of Nutrition, the Journal of Nutritional Biochemistry, Current Nutrition and Food Science, Journal of Nutrigenetics and Nutrigenomics, the Open Nutrition Journal, and the Mature Medicine Canada. He has served as president of the American College of Nutrition. He was a member of the board of directors for the American Society of Nutrition and the International Society of Nutrigenetics and Nutrigenomics. Dr. Miller has presented more than 120 invited lectures at national and international meetings and has published more than 160 research papers, reviews, articles, and abstracts. He has co-edited 3 books on diet, nutrition, and toxicology, and has contributed chapters to 9 books. He is co-author of the Handbook of Dairy Foods and Nutrition, first, second, and third editions. Dr. Miller has appeared on the NBC Today Show, CNBC, CNN, CBS, Evening News, and has been quoted in the New York Times, USA Today, Chicago Tribune, LA Times, and Financial Times London. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Greg Miller.
Good morning. This is what I want to tell you and hopefully convince you by the end of my talk when I share data with you that you'll walk away understanding that, that there's little evidence for an effect of total fat on cardiovascular disease risk anymore. People have let go of fat as a risk factor. Saturated fat is still considered by some to be a contributor to CVD risk. I hope by the time that I'm done in the evidence that I share with you that you'll think it's not much of a risk factor. My prediction is by the 2020 Dietary Guidelines, recommendations to reduce saturated fat in our diet will probably go away. That's my prediction. In 5 years, maybe you can invite me back and we'll talk about whether that came true or not. I think newer evidence really points to carbohydrates as a major driver for obesity, cardiovascular disease, and type 2 diabetes, and I'll share some data around why I think that's the case. And then evidence now indicates that consumption of milk fat may be associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. And again, I'm going to show you some evidence around that. Now, I'm not going to go into details with a lot of specific studies. What I'm really trying to do is show you more of the larger meta-analysis that have been done, because recently a lot of those come out and have summarized the individual studies and give us really some compelling evidence on how we might want to look at the data. So our food fight with fat, when did that start? Well, it started way back in the mid-50s to early 60s. You're all probably aware, Ansel Keys and the 7-country study where he found an association between fat, saturated fat intake, and risk of cardiovascular disease. It really was the landmark study that set us down the path of looking at fat, saturated fat, cholesterol, and heart disease. The data, again, not really great data. It was recall data. There were problems with that. Some people believe that the studies were, that there were more countries with more data that should have been included in the analysis. But nonetheless, that is the landmark study that sent us down this course of having a fight with fat. It got accelerated because members of Congress started having heart attacks, and then President Eisenhower had a heart attack, and then, okay, everybody's running around with their hair on fire saying, we've got to do something about heart disease. The best available evidence we had at the time, 7-country studies, people didn't want to wait until we gathered more data. They said, we've got to move on the science that we have available right now, and they went down the path of beginning to recommend that we restrict our intake of fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. And even then there was arguing about, well, is it saturated fat, is it total fat, is it cholesterol? they all kind of got together and said, hey, let's work together. We'll just make it total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol. And the American Heart Association was born, and dietary recommendations began coming out of the American Heart Association. Well, soon after that, we had dietary guidelines that were being brought out by the government, and it gave us over 35 years of guidelines recommending low-fat and fat-free. Language kind of varied from each version to the other version. Early on, it was just, consume low-fat and fat-free, but if you like whole milk, it's okay. Find other ways to reduce the fat in your diet. And then over time, it got more prescriptive. In 1990, they began to give us specific numbers in terms of less than 30% of our calories from fat, less than 10% of our calories from saturated fat, cholesterol limited to 300 milligrams per day. And it pretty much stayed like that until 2005. In 2005, they began to be a little bit more broad, saying, well, somewhere between 20 to 35% of your calories from total fat could be okay, but we still had recommendations to keep saturated fat down. I'm sorry, that's 2005. 2010, again, we still had a range of saturated fat recommendations. We still had less than 10% of our calories from saturated fat and the 300 milligrams of cholesterol. And recommendations say you would even do better if you got your calories from saturated fat down to 7%. If you've read the Dietary Guidelines report for the 2015 Dietary Guidelines, they've recommended that we let go of cholesterol. There are no discussions around recommendations for where total fat needs to be, and saturated fat, again, they recommend less than 10%. So we'll see what comes out in the final Dietary Guidelines, but I feel like they really didn't review all the available evidence around saturated fat, around milk fat, and that's unfortunate, but I'm hoping that, again, by 2020, we'll see a change in how they're looking at that data. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this slide because, again, we want to move on so that we have time for questions, but you are all dietitians, you're all aware. Why are we talking about fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol? It's about cardiovascular disease, the #1 killer in the U.S., a large amount of people having their first heart attack, and the healthcare costs are enormous. You're all, again, dietitians, so you're all aware about blood cholesterol and cardiovascular disease, the idea that we get cholesterol buildup in our arteries. Within that, we get plaque, and then over time, that plaque can rupture. It causes a clot, and then you have a heart attack. Again, over time, LDL cholesterol has been the primary marker for risk of heart disease, and we look at where LDL is, and then we measure risk relative to LDL. While you can build a statistical model and a statistical case for why LDL is a risk marker for CVD, it's important to realize that there's data that shows that half of the people who have a heart attack have normal LDL levels. So while, yes, it is a predictor, it's not a perfect predictor. We talk about HDL, which is the good cholesterol, and again, more and more people looking at that as a marker as well too. We're going to talk about why LDL may not be the best predictor for cardiovascular disease risk, and why 50% of the people who have normal LDL levels could still potentially have a heart attack. And I'll share with you why we think that may be happening. But again, focus on saturated fat, total fat, and cholesterol was again about its ability to impact blood levels of LDL and HDL to some extent. Now, so this is how we look at it. The model has changed a lot in terms of our thinking. We do understand there are many factors that put us at risk for cardiovascular disease. And I've tried to diagram it here to show that here are the nutritional factors that we think about when we think about risk for heart disease. Fat, saturated fat, unsaturated fat, trans fatty acids, cholesterol, protein, carbohydrate, even vitamins and minerals can play some kind of role in terms of either reducing inflammation or other issues that may increase our risk. Obviously, there are non-nutritional factors as well, too, in terms of genetics, which is a big driver, alcohol, and physical activity. But in terms of the nutritional factors, then, again, we come in and look at, well, what are the markers that we need to be focused on as we begin to think about risk for heart disease? And those risk markers that are directed more towards cardiovascular disease are high LDL cholesterol levels, atherosclerosis, obesity, and hypertension. Those that are leading more towards metabolic syndrome and type 2 diabetes, which increases our risk of cardiovascular disease, are low HDL cholesterol, high triglycerides, impaired fasting glucose, that's a reflection of insulin sensitivity, abdominal fat, and again, hypertension. All risk factors for metabolic syndrome. So when we think about that whole paradigm, what we know about dietary fat obviously has been changing. And far back as 2008, there were several studies that showed that there was no really convincing evidence that total fat was really related to LDL cholesterol and, in fact, outcomes in terms of risk of cardiovascular disease. And in 2008, the Food and Agricultural Organization, which is a part of the WHO, issued a report from their expert consultation. They bring together the world's experts to look and review at all of the available science and conclude what does science tell us today. And they concluded that total fat was not really related to risk of coronary heart disease and cancer as well. We look at cholesterol, as I mentioned earlier. The dietary report that just came out from the Science Advisory Committee for Dietary Guidelines said, it's time to let go of cholesterol. I think we were still the only country that still had recommendations for limiting cholesterol intake. Most countries have given up on this a long time ago, but here's how it turned out in the media. In 1999, people were already talking about it's time for cholesterol to not be labeled as bad. And if you don't think these recommendations aren't important and don't have an impact, you should look at what happened to egg consumption. Egg consumption really declined severely. They're just starting to reemerge in terms of increased sales and consumption within the U.S. And geez, here's a nutrient-rich food, high-quality protein, very affordable, highly digestible and consumable, and we were telling people to eat less. So there are unintended consequences with these dietary guidelines, and we really need to be ingrained in the science. Now, dietitians, you're the front line out there, and early on, our first speaker said you should all get on Twitter and get engaged in social media, and I want to echo and support that recommendation. I did a talk 2 weeks ago at the American Society for Nutrition, and it was on scientists engaging in social media, because I try to do that, and at Dr. Dairy 50 on Twitter. And when I went to prepare for that talk, what I found is that I found different lists of who were the top health and wellness influencers on the internet. Of the top 100, I think there were 4 or 5 who are actually credentialed nutritionists. I don't think there were any in the top 10. Number 1, Michelle Obama. Number 2, Michael Pollan. Dr. Oz, Mark Bittman. These are all people who have no credentials in nutrition. One of the higher ones was a dietitian, Joy Bauer, the Today Show dietitian. So I really encourage you to get engaged and be engaged in that dialogue, because we don't want Dr. Oz telling people how to eat. We want dietitian and nutritionists telling people how to eat. So we've exonerated total fat, we've exonerated cholesterol. Now what about saturated fat? Well, there are a lot of people who built their career on fat and saturated fat, and they still feel like they need to focus on something, so they put the bullseye on saturated fat. But let's talk about where the science is now on saturated fat and what that really means. I think there's limited evidence to say that saturated fat may be related to heart disease. I'm going to show you data that says that if it is, it's probably a very small or minor risk factor as it relates to heart disease. And probably where we need to focus is on the total dietary intake rather than one specific nutrients. And I think you've probably heard that from many speakers in the past. A recent review in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition looked at all of the available evidence, and when they did, they said that there was no significant evidence for concluding that dietary saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular heart disease. So that's the first really full review of the science that said, saturated fat is really not a risk factor for heart disease. Another analysis that came out of this is Dariush Masafarian. He is now the dean at Tufts University. Came out of the Harvard group. in PLOS medicine. And again, looking at replacement of saturated fat by PUFA. And this is the data that keep people saying that, well, saturated fat may still be a risk factor. If we replace saturated fat with polys, we can get some lowering of LDL cholesterol, and therefore we are reducing risk of heart disease. But again, I don't know how good a biomarker LDL really is in the long run. I don't think it's all that good. But this is the evidence that, if you look right here at the top bar here, where they're looking at PUFA replacing saturated fat, you can see the first one is predicted from the total to HDL change. That's the top one here. And then the second one is on the randomized controlled trials. And then you get the final one here, which is the pooled analysis. You see you do get a small lowering of risk based on LDL reduction. But again, that effect is, if you look over here, is pretty small. So when the next area is carbohydrate replacing saturated fat. Again, we're looking at changes in total cholesterol to HDL, and then we're looking at the randomized controlled trials. The pooled analysis shows almost a slight increase in risk, but again, not statistically significant, or just barely statistically significant. And then if we use mono unsaturated fats, again, with the change in total HDL cholesterol, you see one effect, but when you do the pooled analysis, you get a total opposite effect. So the data on monos right now is really mixed. Looking at cardiovascular heart disease and prospective studies, again, this was an analysis done by Chowdhury. Some rumblings about this meta-analysis in that whenever you do these meta-analysis, it's all about the a priori controls you put around what trials are in and what trials are out. What is the criteria for who's in and who's out? And there was some complaining around this analysis that they didn't put in certain studies or they didn't look at them in terms of polys replacing saturated fats. They went and redid the analysis, changing the inclusion criteria, and in the end, the results still came out pretty much the same. And so what we find is when you look at total saturated fatty acids at the top, really not much of an effect. When you look at monos again, not much of an effect. With the omega-3 fatty acids, which is this area right through here, really not much of an effect. When you look at the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, you tend to see a little bit of an effect, but again, it's very small. Some people think, well, that's important because a small effect in this big population in the U.S. could be relatively important, but again, it's a very small effect. We do see on the bottom line here, trans fatty acids, a significant effect, a pretty modest effect of trans fatty acids. I think there's scientific consensus that partially hydrogenated vegetable oils with the trans fats that they deliver are something that we should try to minimize in our diets. And there's some consensus there. Again, this is a continuing of the Chowdhury study. This is looking at cardiovascular heart disease events by circulating fatty acid levels. I'm not going to go through this in great detail. Again, I think the takeaway here is that where there are effects, like here, long-chain fatty acids, omega-3s again, you do again see an effect. It's a modest effect, but everywhere else, basically no effect. Whether it's saturated fat, polys, or monos, the only place we're beginning to see a little bit of effect is with long-chain polyunsaturates, the omega-3. These are randomized controlled trials with fatty acid supplementation. Of course, no randomized trials have been done with supplementation of saturated fat. That would be an ethical question in terms of where some people stand on the relationship between saturated fat and heart disease. But again, looking at alpha-linoleic acid, which would be the top here, high variability, really no effect. Again, then the long-chain omega-3s again, a small effect, but again, high variability, so not statistically significant. And then when we look at omega-3 fatty acids in general, again, there's some effect, but again, it's very highly variable, and as a result of it, it's not statistically significant. So why might LDL not be a good biomarker? Why would changes in LDL not be as important as we originally thought in terms of risk for heart disease? Well, one of the reasons that LDL by itself may not be good is that LDL is made up of different subclasses of particles with differing contents of cholesterol and differing effects on risk for cardiovascular disease. So these LDL proteins come in what we call large fluffy particles or small dense particles. And it's the small dense particles that seem to put us at greater risk for cardiovascular disease because they stay in circulation 3 times longer than the large fluffy LDL. They have greater ability to get into the enamel of the artery and stay there. They are more readily oxidized, and it's that oxidized cholesterol that our body reacts to that causes problems in the artery, and there's a greater retention in the artery. And so those factors make that a much greater risk factor for cardiovascular disease than the large buoyant LDL. So we could look at LDL and have a certain LDL cholesterol number, 130 milligrams per liter, deciliter. But what you find here is that it could be in different form. It could be in small dense particles or large fluffy. So the LDL level would still be measured as the same amount, but you could have differing effects in terms of your risk because you just have much more in terms of more particles when you have the small dense particles. So you could measure your cholesterol and you could be at 130 and you could have a lot of small dense LDL, which would put you at greater risk. Or you could have 130 and have the large fluffy and not be at much risk. So being able to measure a particle size is going to be really important in the future. And that test is much more readily available right now. Now, when we look at saturated fat and its relationship to LDL, what we see is that consumption of saturated fat is associated with an increased risk of the large fluffy LDL and a decrease in small dense LDL, with no effect on small or very small LDL. So small and very small LDL particles are reduced by lower carbohydrate, but not by lower saturated fat. So this is where we begin to think about carbohydrates and the influence that carbohydrates may be having on our risk for cardiovascular disease. So when we look down to this bottom right-hand corner here, what we see from the data is reduced carb lowers small LDL irrespective of saturated fat intake. So the blue represents high saturated fat intake, which is about 15% of our energy, and the orange bar represents low saturated fat intake, which is around 8%. What we see here is that there's no effect between the two in terms of impact on small LDL. But when we look at large LDL, what we see is we do get to get a differentiation. So when we lower carbohydrates, we lower small dense LDL. We do get some rise in the large fluffy LDL as well, but we get a much larger rise. If you look on the blue bar on the far left there, you see that saturated fat actually increases the amount of large fluffy LDL. So you get a little bit of a boost from reducing carbs, but you get a much larger boost by increasing saturated fat. So does increasing LDL cholesterol with saturated fat translate to higher cardiovascular disease risk? Well, again, we see the effect of saturated fat really on the large LDL particles, which are associated with reduced risk of cardiovascular disease. So less likely that saturated fat is going to cause an increased risk. Carbohydrates, especially sugars, have an influence on small LDL. You're going to get an increase in small LDL particles, which are likely to put you at increased risk. We haven't talked about HDL here, but one of the other factors that you get with saturated fat intake is you get an increase in HDL as well, too. So your total HDL cholesterol ratio will become better as well, too, or be neutral. So what's happening with carbohydrates? And these are slides lent to me by Jeff Volek. who's now at Ohio State University, the Ohio State, for those folks who went there. Cholesterol ingestion, carbohydrate ingestion impacts blood glucose levels. And when we get elevated blood glucose levels, we all know that we put insulin out to bring the blood glucose levels down into the normal range. And so that glucose gets pushed into tissues. When it gets pushed into tissues, it's either stored as glycogen or burnt for energy. And when the levels get too high, when we have high levels, we can only store so much, and we only utilize so much for energy, then we begin to make saturated fat with that. And what we see then is we get an elevation here in synthesis of saturated fatty acid, and that's where we begin to see problems in terms of risk for cardiovascular disease. It's that circulating level of saturated fatty acids that are associated with an increased risk. And again, I'm not going to go through each individual study here, but there are at least 4 different studies that have looked very closely at circulating levels of saturated fatty acids in terms of risk for cardiovascular disease, and have shown a strong association between these circulating levels of these saturated fats that we make in our body with increased risk for cardiovascular disease. Here's a study that was done by Jeff Volek, and I have to declare we actually funded this study, so in terms of transparency, this was a really unique study. He took overweight people who were at risk for metabolic syndrome and at risk for getting type 2 diabetes, and put them on either a carbohydrate-restricted diet, which with increased levels of fat and saturated fat, or put them on a low-fat diet. And this says 12 gram here, but that's a typo. So for those of you who download my slides and look at them later, this should be 32 grams, not 12. I'm sorry I couldn't get it fixed before I got to the meeting, and so I apologize for that, but that should be 32 grams. But what you see here with carbohydrate restriction is that you get a significant change in serum fatty acid levels. With carbohydrate restriction, you get a much larger, so you have higher saturated fat intake, but lower carbohydrate intake, and what you get is a very significant decline in the circulating levels of those saturated fatty acids that were shown in previous studies to increase risk of cardiovascular disease. If we look at the white bar here, where we have increased carbohydrate but significantly reduced saturated fat intake, you get a small decline in circulating levels of those saturated fats, but not as great as you get when you restrict carbohydrates. And this is just measuring those saturated fats either as they lie in the triglyceride or within cholesterol esters. So the thought behind what's going on here then is that you are what you save from what you eat. So if we are eating a mixed diet here, if it's lower in carbohydrates, you're going to use saturated fatty acids for energy. You're going to ramp up your ability to oxidize saturated fatty acids and use those for energy, and you're going to reduce synthesis because you have low amounts of carbohydrate in circulation. As a result, you're putting less insulin into the system, and you're looking at that side of the metabolic curve. But if you're consuming more carbohydrates with your diet, and you have higher carbohydrate intake, then what you're doing then is you're pushing yourself to using carbohydrates for energy. When you've maximized carbohydrate storage, you're going to increase saturated fatty acid synthesis and storage, and then you're going to get higher levels of these circulating saturated fatty acids that increase risk for cardiovascular disease. And so this is the theory in terms of how carbohydrates may be influencing saturated fatty acid levels in circulation and increasing risk for cardiovascular disease rather than dietary saturated fat itself. So I'm going to move now on to milk fat and talk a little bit about milk fat. And again, milk fat does not equal saturated fat. I think you guys probably all know that. But if you talk to the average consumer out there, they've been told so often to drink and consume only low-fat and fat-free because of concerns around saturated fat and calories. They would say that it is saturated fat, and that's why some people actually exclude dairy groups from their diet. It's a very complex mixture of fatty acids. There are over 400 different fatty acids within milk fat, And again, I think we also have to think about the fact that milk fat comes into our diets through this matrix called food, which is cheese, milk, yogurt, and there may be other components of that dairy food that may be impacting our risk for heart disease as well too. So here's a very recent meta-analysis that came out in the Asia Pacific Journal of Clinical Nutrition. Probably not one we read every day, but I have set up special alerts on my computer, and when a study comes up related to dairy, I tend to be able to find it. Again, what this study shows is that, again, looking at all of these prospective cohort studies, that they find a small effect of dairy consumption on reduced risk for cardiovascular disease. Again, not a very large effect, but nonetheless, a positive effect, statistically significant. Not terribly huge, but nonetheless, these small effects over the long haul may be somewhat important. Dietary fat in cardiovascular disease. This is a really nice done by Mario Kratz up in Washington in the European Journal of Nutrition. Again, the orange bars here represent studies that show a neutral or positive effect in terms of reduced risk for cardiovascular disease. The yellow bars represent neutral studies. The yellow bars represent studies that showed an increased risk, and then the white bars show studies that were neutral. So in here, we get kind of a mixture of studies, but what we see is the majority of studies are neutral to beneficial rather than at increased risk. And if you looked at the study design of those ones that showed an increased risk, we could talk about how that impacted what they were able to find. Looking at adiposity, again, orange bars represents reduced adiposity with increased dairy fat intake. White bars represent neutral. So in all of these various studies, most of the studies show higher dairy intake reduces body adiposity, and there's a few studies that are neutral in that effect. Dairy fat and metabolic health, again, the majority of the studies show positive benefits of dairy fat intake in looking at different metabolic factors like fasting glucose, fasting insulin, and other factors. Type 2 diabetes, again, you would suspect based on the previous slide, most of the studies show a decreased risk of type 2 diabetes with increased dairy fat intake, neutral to slight increases in a couple of studies, and then one neutral study. This is an interesting study where they looked at folks' intake of dairy foods in high school. Again, remembering way back then, there's lots of problems with some of the analysis and looking at current diet. What I thought was really interesting with this study, and the reason I wanted to share it is that the relationship was primarily driven by full-fat dairy consumption. So if they had good dairy consumption in high school, good dairy consumption as an adult, they had lower risk of type 2 diabetes, and that's the small blue line right here. If they had good consumption in high school but not good consumption as adult, some small reduced risk, but not as great as when they continue to consume dairy foods, primarily fuller fat dairy products. Again, another slide on the risk for type 2 diabetes. Again here, we won't go through it in detail, but again, overall showing a small but significant effect in terms of reduced risk for type 2 diabetes. So a couple of different meta-analyses showing the same effect. Looking at cheese and yogurt, there's some really good studies that have been looking at fermented dairy products and the role that fermented dairy products may play in reducing risk of cardiovascular disease. Again, some good data showing up there, particularly with yogurt. Yogurt seems to have the strongest association between reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. And that's because dairy foods deliver palmitoleic acid. Say that 3 times real quick. It's difficult. But nonetheless, this is a study by Mazafarian, who's really interested in the effect. People who consume whole milk dairy products tend to have more of this in their blood. And what we find is that as that increases in our blood, we see a decreased risk of type 2 diabetes. So we're really interested in that, and there'll be further research being done in that area. And of course, a lot of that coming from cheese and whole milk dairy products. Again, higher levels of this particular fatty acid not only associated with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes, but lower systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, and lower triglycerides. Okay, this study here is just to show you that when we look at beef consumption, we don't see those odd chain fatty acids that are associated with reduced risk of type 2 diabetes. When we use dairy foods, we do see increased blood levels of those odd chain fatty acids and reduced risk as well. And that's coming from dairy foods. That's what this slide shows. This study, real quick, just to show you, is again looking at cheese and blood lipids. What we found is that when we feed people cheese, we tend to lower LDL. We also lowered HDL, but the total HDL level remains unchanged. In fact, with butter, we saw an increase in LDL, which you would predict. But guess what? Increase in HDL as well, so the total to HDL level was unchanged. So with cheese and butter intake, we're seeing no change in the ratio of total to HDL cholesterol levels. Again, I just wanted to quickly show, well, what is it about dairy that may be unique besides these unique fatty acids? There's other things that are going on as well too. And what we see here is that when we increase our intake of dairy products, we're also increasing the amount of fat we excrete. What happens is the calcium in dairy foods binds with certain saturated fats, forms insoluble soaps. These insoluble soaps then are carried through the intestine and out into the toilet, and we don't absorb them. They have no effect on our blood LDL levels, and so that may be one of the mechanisms that may be involved in what we're seeing. We have a lot of future research going on. We're really interested in the uniqueness of dairy foods and milk fat and its potential impact on type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. I think there's a lot of real emerging science that is showing that consumption of dairy foods, particularly whole milk dairy foods, may actually be good for us. And with that, I thank you for your attention.